U.S. President Joe Biden's warning that the U.S. would defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression has made headlines around the world and put growing tensions between the small democratic island and its neighboring autocratic superpower back under the spotlight, almost a decade ago. Ties seem to be on the mend as the two sides, separate by a strait that is fewer than 80 miles or 128 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, deepened economic, cultural, and even political engagements, but today, relations are at their lowest point in decades, raising fears of military escalation. Even as experts caution that an imminent all-out war remains unlikely. In recent months, China's tacit support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only fueled speculation over Beijing's intentions with Taiwan, raising questions about how the world might react should China launch an attack, though the White House quickly downplayed Biden's comments. No other country is as deeply intertwined in the dispute as the United States, which has a complicated history with both sides and has long trod a delicate middle path. China's authoritarian turn under leader Xi Jinping and plummeting relations with Washington have pulled Taiwan closer into the orbit of the U.S. This has infuriated Beijing, spurring it to unleash more pressure on Taiwan and sending cross-strait relations on a downward spiral. Here's what you need to know about the island increasingly at the forefront of U.S.-China clashes. First, a quick history. Taiwan, which has long been inhabited by indigenous peoples, became part of the Chinese Empire in the 17th century. It was then ceded to Japan in 1895 after Imperial China lost the First Sino-Japanese War. The island remained a Japanese colony for half a century until the end of World War II. Following the Allied defeat of Japan, China's ruling nationalist government, led by the Kuomintang, took control of Taiwan. Not long after, the nationalists, which ruled the mainland under the Republic of China, ROC, banner following the fall of Imperial China, came under renewed attack from an insurgent Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The two sides entered into a bloody civil war that resulted in the eventual defeat of the nationalists, who fled to Taiwan, moving the seat of the ROC government from Nanjing to Taipei. Across the strait, the CCP took power and established the People's Republic of China, PRC, in Beijing. Both proclaimed themselves the sole rightful government of the entire Chinese territory. In Taipei, the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, dreamed of one day retaking the mainland. In Beijing, CCP chairman Mao Zedong deemed Taiwan the last piece to a united new China, a problem that needed to be solved sooner or later. Taiwan has downplayed its territorial claims over mainland China in recent years, and it is now a thriving democracy with its own military, currency, constitution, and elected government. But it is not recognized as an independent country by most governments in the world and has become increasingly isolated diplomatically. Over the years, an increasing number of governments have switched their diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, leaving Taiwan with only 15 diplomatic allies at the end of 2021. So what's the US's role in all this? During the Chinese Civil War, the United States backed the nationalists while the communists had support from the Soviet Union. The U.S. continued to support the Kuomintang government after its retreat to Taiwan, providing it with development assistance to help build its economy. All the while shunning the PRC as an ideological and military adversary. But following a diplomatic conflict between Beijing and Moscow in the 1960s, known as the Sino-Soviet split, relations between the PRC and the U.S. began to thaw to counterbalance the Soviet Union. By 1979, the U.S. joined a growing list of nations to formally switch diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, in what is known as the One China policy. Washington recognizes the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China. It also acknowledges Beijing's position that Taiwan is part of China, but has never accepted the CCP's claim of sovereignty over the island. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to retain close unofficial ties with Taiwan under the terms of the decades-old Taiwan Relations Act, facilitating commercial, cultural, and other exchanges through the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT, the de facto U.S. Embassy in Taipei. Washington has also been supplying the island with defensive weaponry, but it has remained deliberately vague on whether it would defend the island in case of a Chinese invasion, a policy known as strategic ambiguity. This is meant to keep a lid on the showdown by deterring China by keeping open the possibility of a U.S. military response. At the same time, it's aimed at depriving Taiwan of U.S. assurances that could prompt it to declare official independence. The goal is to preserve the status quo and to avoid a war in Asia, and it has worked, allowing Washington to walk the tightrope of relations with both sides. But under Biden, that strategic ambiguity has become somewhat less ambiguous. Since taking office, Biden has said on 3 occasions that the U.S. would be willing to intervene militarily should China attack, though the White House has rushed to walk back his remarks each time. But his latest warning against Beijing carried extra symbolic weight. It was made right on China's doorstep during his first trip to Asia as president, which is aimed at uniting allies and partners to counter China's rising influence. As expected, Beijing has reacted angrily to his remarks, expressing its strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition and accusing the U.S. of playing with fire. Then why are tensions increasing? For decades since the founding of the PRC, animosity has reigned between Beijing and Taipei, with trade, travel, and communication largely cut off. Military conflicts continued to flare up, with the PRC shelling several outlying islands controlled by the ROC on 2 separate occasions. But tensions began to ease in the late 1980s, allowing limited private visits, indirect trade, and investment across the strait. The ties reached a peak in 2015 during a historic meeting between the heads of the KMT and CCP in Singapore. But relations deteriorated quickly after 2016, when Tsai Ing-wen of the traditionally pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, won a landslide presidential election in Taiwan, propelled by concerns among voters that Taiwan was moving too close to Beijing under the KMT government. And under Xi, China has become increasingly assertive in foreign policy and grown more authoritarian at home. Its relentless crackdown on democracy and freedoms in Hong Kong has further alienated many people in Taiwan, who fear they could face the same fate were they to be under Beijing's rule. Tensions are running especially high as the Chinese military ramps up its pressure on the island in response to what Beijing sees as provocations by the Taiwanese and U.S. administrations. How likely is conflict? After aggressive military displays from Beijing in 2021, Taiwan's defense minister warned that China would be able to mount a full-scale invasion of Taiwan by 2025, prompting discussions on potential armed conflict. The Chinese military maneuvers and drills are a reminder to Taiwan and the U.S. not to cross Beijing's red lines, said Bonnie Glaser, director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She said those red lines include campaigning for formal Taiwan independence or a decision to deploy large numbers of U.S. troops to the island. In an interview with CNN last year, President Tsai said the threat from Beijing was growing every day. But on the streets of Taipei, the mood appears to be mostly relaxed and confident, and analysts agree that despite the rhetoric and the military saber-rattling, China is unlikely to invade Taiwan anytime soon. According to people familiar with the assessments, U.S. intelligence officials have also not yet seen anything to suggest that China is preparing a military offensive. On Monday, Biden also echoed such an assessment. "My expectation is it will not happen," he told reporters. Aiming for a peaceful resolution to the standoff across the Taiwan Strait makes sense. Experts have long said that any attempt by Beijing to forcefully take the island would be a hugely costly endeavor with an uncertain outcome. Moreover, the swift and coordinated response from the U.S. and its allies to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has likely alarmed Beijing, say experts, who suggest its leaders are watching Western reaction to Ukraine with Taiwan in mind. It remains to be seen what lessons Beijing will draw from the Ukraine crisis. It could become more cautious in its calculations in light of Russia's floundering invasion and the strong Western response. But on the other hand, Beijing could also conclude that any attempt to take the island by force will only get harder the longer they wait, as Taiwan may get more serious about its defense and the U.S. and its allies may get more serious about preparing with Taiwan for that fight. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi met in Luxembourg for unannounced talks on a number of regional and global security issues, with Taiwan high on the list. According to a White House official, Sullivan reiterated Washington's concerns about China's coercive and aggressive actions in the Taiwan Strait. These include regular military aircraft sorties into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. The meeting came after Chinese and U.S. defense ministers exchanged heated words about Taiwan during the Shangri-La Dialogue, an Asian defense summit, in Singapore on Sunday. Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe reiterated Beijing's determination to crush Taiwan's attempt to pursue independence. "If anyone dares to secede Taiwan from China, we will not hesitate to fight. We will fight at all costs, and we will definitely fight to the very end. This is the only choice for China," he said. Wei also urged the U.S. to stop smearing and containing China, stop interfering in China's internal affairs, and stop harming China's interests. These comments were made after U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin slammed Beijing for its coercive and aggressive approach to its territorial claims. "We've witnessed a steady increase in provocative and destabilizing military activity near Taiwan, and that includes PLA or Chinese military aircraft flying near Taiwan in record numbers in recent months and nearly on a daily basis," he said. On Sunday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said that China has sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction over the Taiwan Strait, arguing that there was no legal basis to call the Taiwan Strait international waters. Countries call the Taiwan Strait international waters in order to find a pretext for manipulating issues related to Taiwan and China's sovereignty and security. "China is firmly against this," he said. Taiwan rejected Beijing's claims, insisting that the Taiwan Strait does consist of international waters except for areas that can be defined as territorial waters. "Our government has always respected any activities conducted by foreign vessels in the Taiwan Strait that are allowed by international law," said Taiwanese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Joanne Oh. According to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, countries can claim an area that is 12 nautical miles from their coastline as territorial seas. Exclusive economic zones, EEZ, are areas up to 200 nautical miles from their coasts. Since most of the Taiwan Strait is fewer than 200 nautical miles wide, this results in overlapping EEZ claims in the Taiwan Strait between China and Taiwan. Zeno Leone, a defense studies lecturer at King's College London, told DW that China's sovereignty claim over the Taiwan Strait is a way to challenge international law and the freedom of navigation, which has been repeatedly upheld by the US and its allies. China disagrees with freedom of navigation and international law because they think these were all set up by the US after World War II, he said. Wan Ti-sung, a lecturer in Taiwan studies at Australian National University, ANU, currently based in Taiwan, said that China's sovereignty claim over the waterway could further destabilize the region and increase saber-rattling, heightening the risks of accidental military escalation. Beijing's pronouncement will likely prompt increasing public pushback from the US, he said. The US Navy's freedom of navigation operations in and around the Taiwan Strait will likely increase in frequency and publicity, to signal that the US disagrees with Beijing's position. Taiwan's tense status quo. Taiwan is democratically self-governed, but Beijing considers it to be a renegade province, which one day will be reunited with mainland China. The US walks a diplomatic tightrope between China and Taiwan, maintaining unofficial diplomatic relations with Taipei and helping Taiwan maintain a self-defense capacity under the Taiwan Relations Act. However, under the One China policy, the US acknowledges there is only one Chinese government, which is the cornerstone of preserving relations with Beijing. Last month, US President Joe Biden said the US would militarily protect Taiwan if the island were attacked by China. However, Defense Secretary Austin and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken have both emphasized that Washington's policy towards Taiwan has not shifted. Jessica Drun, an analyst at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, told DW that Biden's comments were nothing more than reiterating long-standing US policy towards Taiwan. Sung from the ANU said while Beijing's rhetoric is graphic, it doesn't say anything new regarding its long-standing threat to use force against Taiwan. Asian security analysts say China's calculation on whether to invade Taiwan centers on the PLA's ability to win a war that may involve the US. Though Russia's invasion of Ukraine has raised fears that China could do something similar in Taiwan, some experts doubt this will happen. The fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine is not going to change China's calculation on that matter, and I think China's calculation is that it will not be able to win a war that involves the US for at least another 10 years, said Lin Kwok, a senior fellow for Asia-Pacific at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. If anything, the war in Ukraine and how it's panned out might make China even more reluctant to take military action against Taiwan in the near to medium term, she told DW. Other observers point out that since Beijing is very risk-averse, it knows that a military offensive against Taiwan will be extremely challenging. On Taiwan's tiny Penghu Islands, the missile bases that sit next to white sand beaches and bustling fish markets are a visceral reminder of the constant threat of attack from China. Despite the huge military discrepancy between the two sides, many analysts believe Taiwan's location, inhospitable terrain, and US support mean China would find a full-scale invasion extremely hard, and possibly too costly to countenance. Recent records of Chinese fighter jet incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and increasingly aggressive rhetoric under President Xi Jinping have raised fears that China might contemplate acting on that pledge sooner rather than later. The Chinese Defense Ministry last week said it would not hesitate to start a war to stop Taiwan from becoming independent. One U.S. admiral has said an attack could come by 2027, the centennial of China's People's Liberation Army, PLA. If we were to go head-to-head militarily, we don't have a single chance, retired Admiral Li Shimin, who was head of Taiwan's armed forces until 2019, told AFP bluntly. However, Russia's failure to quickly overrun Ukraine serves as a cautionary tale to Beijing, while also providing Taipei with tactical blueprints and inspiration for dealing with a much larger foe. "Our soldiers here are all Taiwanese and will be fighting to defend their homeland," said Shin Ing-jin, a Penghu historian and architect. "That makes a difference. Just look at Ukraine." Taiwan's biggest advantage is its geography. Amphibious assaults are exceedingly difficult, and if China was to invade Taiwan, and crucially hold it, Beijing would need to move hundreds of thousands of troops as well as equipment across the Taiwan Strait. Even at its narrowest point, the strait is 130 kilometers wide and weather conditions are notoriously unforgiving with 2 monsoon seasons. According to a U.S. Naval War College report, that leaves just 2 brief windows of attack, May to July and October, for such a large-scale operation. Outlying islands, such as the Penghu chain, are also dotted throughout the waters, with radar and missiles pointing directly out into the strait. With the likely early warning and the weaponry Taipei has at its disposal, the PLA would probably incur high losses even in that first stage of transit, said James Char, an associate research fellow at Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And while the small, flat outlying islands might in the end prove easy for Beijing to subdue, on Taiwan's main island, the opposite applies. The coastal terrain there is a defender's dream come true, according to Ian Easton, author of The Chinese Invasion Threat. He and his colleagues estimate that Taiwan only has 14 small beaches suitable for landing, and even those are bordered by mountains, cliffs, or dense urban infrastructure. Landing on Taiwan is only part of the problem, Bonnie Lin, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, SISE, told AFP. Progress through Taiwan's wetlands, mountains, and densely populated urban areas will require a huge range of different combat skills and weapons. How is it going to sustain those forces once they're in position and advancing? How is it going to do the logistics? Lin asked. Weapons. China has spent hundreds of billions of dollars upgrading its military capabilities over the past decade, and its statistical dominance over Taiwan is enormous. The PLA has over 1 million ground force personnel to Taiwan's 88,000, 6,300 tanks compared with 800, and 1,600 fighter jets to 400, according to the U.S. Department of Defense. Washington also estimates Beijing has the world's largest navy by ship number. A recent U.S. Naval War College paper described those ships as increasingly sophisticated, capable vessels. But many experts, including both Char and Lin, question whether they are yet capable enough. Atlantic Council senior advisor Harlan Ullman put it more forcefully in a February paper: China simply lacks the military capability and capacity to launch a full-scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan for the foreseeable future. In the meantime, Taiwan has plans to counter China's might in numbers, with retired Admiral Lee highlighting asymmetric warfare, an emphasis on mobility and precision attacks, an approach U.S. officials are reportedly encouraging. Lee pointed to the success of the Ukrainian mobile missile launcher that sank Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva. Taiwan has built up stockpiles of mobile missile batteries and shoulder-launched weapons, but he said they needed lots more. U.S. support. The factor that preoccupies Beijing most is who else might get involved in the conflict, Chinese military expert Song Zhongping told AFP. The difficulty of liberating Taiwan lies in the potential intervention of the United States. It's the biggest obstacle for the PLA to clear, he said. The United States officially maintains a strategic ambiguity on whether it will intervene militarily in the event of an invasion. But it supplies Taiwan with military hardware, and President Joe Biden has said multiple times that Washington would intervene. The extent, depth, and breadth of the U.S. and other allies' involvement would greatly determine how any conflict would play out, said Song. Some wargame scenarios see the PLA taking out U.S. bases in the Pacific to kneecap its ability to respond. Washington would be heavily reliant on aircraft carriers operating far from home. To counter that threat, China has prioritized the development of hypersonic carrier-killer missiles and militarized multiple atolls in the disputed South China Sea. But an attack on U.S. forces could provoke a more determined backlash and draw American allies into a global conflict. Even without a military intervention, Char said the threat of economic sanctions like those placed on Russia would give the Chinese leadership pause for thought. Political willpower. The question of whether China would be prepared to cause mass casualties with an invasion, while risking its domestic and international image, is a fundamental one. You need to let China know that it will suffer tremendous losses, and even then it may still not be able to occupy Taiwan, said Li. So that China will think that the best way to resolve the Taiwan problem is by peaceful means. There are a range of other options short of all-out invasion that Beijing could use to bring Taipei to its knees, including a Taiwan Strait blockade, annexation of the outlying islands, or incapacitation of military and cyber systems. China might come up with other formulations or creative diplomatic strategic solutions to declare unification with Taiwan without actually having achieved that, Saislin said. Chinese analyst Song said Beijing has made its invasion trigger clear. The timing depends on the behavior of the Taiwanese separatists and if they insist on advocating for Taiwan's independence, he said. The island's 23 million people have increasingly embraced a distinct Taiwanese identity, and President Tsai Ing-wen, who views the island as a sovereign state, has won 2 elections. The next presidential elections are due in 2024, and Ukraine's fate has only further hardened attitudes towards China. In a survey conducted in May, 61.4% of respondents said they were willing to take up arms in the event of an invasion. The decision ultimately rests with Xi Jinping, the most authoritarian Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, who has been central to the rising fears that China will invade Taiwan. Xi is on the cusp of securing an unprecedented 3rd term this year. And since he came to power, Char said, there's been a total shift from the previous mantra of peace and development towards Taiwan. Instead, he added, Xi has pushed the mantra of accomplish something magnificent and great. In a landmark 2019 speech on Taiwan, she said unification was an inevitable requirement for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. The web of policies and norms that has preserved peace in the Taiwan Strait for 4 decades is stretched to the breaking point. The Taiwanese people, despite living in a mature democracy, remain trapped in an international accommodation agreed on by the United States, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in Beijing, and Taiwan's own previous authoritarian regime. Today, each successive generation in Taiwan finds the notion of political unification with the mainland less appealing. China's leaders, however, are intent on preserving the dictatorship of the CCP, which entails asserting control over all of China's claimed territories, including Taiwan. Meanwhile, the current U.S. administration has adopted a foreign policy doctrine of global democratic renewal amid strategic competition, with China named as the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge. The shrinking common ground among the three capitals' respective One China policies will soon vanish, incentivizing CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping to take action. In the past, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, did not possess the capability to annex Taiwan using military force. Today, Beijing's more modern and capable military presents, or will soon present, such an option to Beijing. Testifying to Congress in May 2022, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines agreed that the threat to Taiwan is critical, or acute, between now and 2030. The shrinking common ground among the three capitals' respective One China policies will soon vanish, incentivizing CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping to take action. She will weigh the risk of failure and anticipated cost of action in deciding whether to exercise such an option. To increase his risk perception, Taipei and Washington should urgently enhance military deterrence with sufficient cost-effective, resilient capabilities to deny, or at least delay, a Chinese invasion force. To raise Xi's cost perception, Washington should abandon political hedging and enhance deterrence messages that credibly signal U.S. resolve across diplomatic, military, and economic spheres. In addition to deterring China, clearer signals of U.S. resolve over Taiwan would reassure allies and partners, some of whom would likely respond by enhancing their own deterrence contributions, creating a virtuous cycle. Some nascent steps are bearing fruit, but more can and should be done. First, Washington should consistently highlight Beijing's failure to honor its promise to pursue a peaceful resolution. Second, the American Institute in Taiwan should publicize training and interactions between U.S. service members and their Taiwanese counterparts. Third, President Joe Biden should explicitly authorize the imposition of financial, trade, and immigration restrictions on China in the event of an attack on Taiwan. Finally, the executive branch should consult with Congress to ensure the latter has the tools to compete effectively across the spectrum of conflict, including in a crisis. Taipei's One China. At the CCP's Quintennial Party Congress in late 2022, Xi will likely renew his tenure as General Secretary of the party, promote many of his loyalists, and retire most of his detractors from within the party. Just as these promotions and retirements will dictate China's future governance, Taiwan's January 2024 presidential contest will have major cross-strait implications. Some predict that the election of Vice President Lai Ching-te to succeed President Tsai Ing-wen, both are from the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, will inflame cross-strait tensions and possibly precipitate a crisis. But Beijing already refuses to engage with the DPP, portraying Tsai as the leader of an illegitimate separatist faction controlled by the United States. Following her 2020 re-election, Tsai stated that even without a formal declaration, we are an independent country already and that younger Taiwanese are pretty used to the idea that we have a separate identity, and we are a country of our own. The Taiwanese people, practical and pluralistic, widely support preserving the status quo of neither unification nor formal independence. Tsai, if elected, is unlikely to press the issue much further than Lai. On the other hand, Taiwan's unification-leaning opposition Kuomintang, KMT, party could further set back cross-strait relations. Driven off the Chinese mainland by the CCP in 1949, the KMT decamped to Taiwan as the Republic of China's, ROC, government in exile and ruled the island under martial law for 4 decades. Taiwan transitioned to democracy in the 1990s, and the KMT conducted its first peaceful transfer of power to the DPP in 2000. The KMT returned to power in 2008 and held it until Tsai's 2016 election as president. To this day, Taiwan retains its ROC constitution and officially claims all of China's territory as its own, even as each successive generation of Taiwanese people feels less connected to the mainland. Since the 2014 Sunflower Movement protesting the then KMT government's cross-strait economic engagement policies, the party has failed to address the waning popularity of its unification-leaning policy platform. While the KMT remains competitive in local elections, the party has not reckoned with its decisive losses in the 2016 and 2020 national elections. To appease its shrinking political base of Weishengryn, those who immigrated from the mainland to Taiwan around 1949, and its donor base of Taisheng, Taiwanese businesspeople whose fortunes are entwined with the mainland. The KMT continues to cling to the 1992 consensus, an agreement whereby Beijing respect ED and accept GED while disagreeing with Taipei's interpretation of One China as the Republic of China, headquartered in Taipei. Since 1992, the cross-strait balance of power, economic, military, and diplomatic, has swung ominously in China's favor, and Beijing's position on the 1992 consensus has shifted with it. Beijing no longer acknowledges respective formulations of One China. Instead, its One China principle now seeks to delegitimize Taiwan's elected government in all fora worldwide. True to the electorate, Tsai has not affirmed the 1992 consensus, and Beijing has refused to engage Taipei in dialogue since 2016. As a result, the two sides of the strait have only grown further apart. Nonetheless, the KMT has persevered in maintaining the 1992 consensus, arguing that it serves as a basis for cross-strait dialogue. In addition to this cross-strait policy conundrum, the KMT must also reckon with widespread Taiwanese loathing of Beijing's governance record, especially in Hong Kong. Since Hong Kong's 1997 return to China from British colonial rule, Beijing has governed Hong Kong as a special administrative region under its One Country, Two Systems framework, originally proposed as a model for Taiwan. On January 2, 2019, Xi Jinping reiterated Beijing's call for unification with Taiwan under this framework, based on the One China principle and the 1992 consensus. But the Taiwanese people overwhelmingly reject the One Country, Two Systems model and largely deny the 1992 consensus, as reflected by the decisive 2020 DPP election victories. Hong Kong's hastening loss of autonomy and civil liberties since then has only sharpened these sentiments in Taiwan. Thus, the KMT faces a dilemma. A significant and growing majority of Taiwanese people do not want political union with the mainland, certainly not if it is imposed on them. Following its 2020 electoral defeat, the KMT rejected the One Country, Two Systems framework but continued to assert the 1992 consensus. As 2024 approaches, growing repression in Hong Kong and shifting demographics in Taiwan may finally convince the KMT to modify or relinquish the last planks of its unification platform. If not, the party risks falling into irrelevancy and Taiwan's democracy risks losing its loyal opposition. Beijing's One China. If the KMT chooses self-preservation and shifts its cross-strait policy platform to reflect Taiwan's mainstream views, Xi Jinping will face his own dilemma. Beijing will find it difficult, if not impossible, to sustain its fictional narrative of a Taiwanese population yearning to rejoin the Chinese motherland. And if the KMT does not forsake the 1992 consensus, its waning political relevance will similarly beset Beijing, albeit in chronic rather than acute fashion. A cross-strait policy formulation that can satisfy the needs of both the CCP and KMT may no longer exist. For autocratic leaders like Xi, perception is crucial to legitimacy. Without a credible pro-unification touchstone on Taiwan, she will feel more aggrieved and may abandon Beijing's stated policy of peaceful unification. Especially as he has argued that the Taiwan problem should not be passed down to future generations. She recognizes that he cannot continue to ignore Taiwanese trends indefinitely. Top CCP officials have begun to hint at a possible Taiwan policy shift at the 2022 Party Congress, though details remain unclear. The U.S. One China policy has long held that a final resolution must be peaceful and according to the wishes of the people. In China's version, however, promoting peaceful unification while not giving up the use of force is like two sides of the same coin. In other words, Beijing intends to use its growing military power to coerce a result to its own liking. As much as Beijing would prefer to avoid open conflict, Taiwanese popular sentiment increasingly shows the limits and often counterproductivity of China's non-violent approach, increasing the incentive to resort to more heavy-handed means. Unlike in Hong Kong, she cannot gain control of Taiwan through quasi-legal maneuvering and co-opting law enforcement. However, Beijing could make its first move in an act of coercive lawfare by invoking its 2005 anti-secession law, which states that when possibilities for a peaceful reunification should be completely exhausted, the state shall employ non-peaceful means and other necessary measures to protect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Presumably, she would then accelerate and amplify his narrative case for the use of force, taking a page from Vladimir Putin's playbook. But to succeed where Putin has failed, she needs a military that is up to the task. Following years of spending increases, technology assimilation, and organizational restructuring, the PLA is now expanding and refining its ability and capacity to project power through the increasing scale and sophistication of exercises on China's periphery, including near Taiwan. PLA spokespersons and other CCP mouthpieces have likewise become more assertive in their diplomacy and rhetoric, often leveraging these offshore exercises for coercive signaling. Most U.S. experts agree that China's investments in military modernization over the past 3 decades have been transformative and that the PLA is quickly approaching an invasion capability, if not already there. Having personally ordered and overseen the acceleration of military reforms over the past decade, she is likely also gaining confidence in his forces, lowering his perceived risk of failure if he chooses to invade. Beijing's increasingly credible operational capability arguably represents the most fundamental change in the cross-strait dynamic in more than 4 decades. It imparts more leverage to Xi than his predecessors enjoyed, one of whom suffered the ignominy of failing to bend Taiwan to China's political will during the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. Beijing keenly understands that without a credible invasion threat, China cannot coerce Taiwan into submission. Washington's One China. Despite China's military reforms and buildup across the strait, Taipei and Washington neglected to maintain a credible military deterrence posture. Taipei resisted the necessary force structure changes to effectively counter the evolving PLA threat. And for 2 decades following the 1996 crisis, guided by academic advisors and intelligence analysts, U.S. policy on China reflected the United States post-Cold War overconfidence even as the cross-strait military balance steadily shifted in Beijing's favor. China's 2001 World Trade Organization accession and the September 11th attacks played significant roles as well, as Washington attempted to cultivate Beijing as a partner in globalization and counterterror. To this day, U.S. officials make overtures to cooperation, often overlooking the long-standing pattern of China's transactional approach to foreign relations. For years, Washington delayed and omitted hard security initiatives and other deterrence actions for Taiwan in pursuit of constructive engagement with Beijing. In hindsight, numerous U.S.-China dialogues led to Beijing's deflections and underwhelming promises on human rights, intellectual property, industrial overcapacity, state subsidies, cyber theft, proliferation, counterterrorism, pollution, and militarization in the South China Sea. These agreements remain overwhelmingly unfulfilled or inconsequential to this day. U.S. engagement policies instead fueled rapid growth in China's industrial and technology sectors, enabling PLA modernization. By favoring U.S.-China engagement over U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation for more than 2 decades, Washington mortgaged its own future security, falling ever deeper into a deterrence deficit. Perversely, avoiding provocation in past years has dramatically increased the likelihood and danger of major conflict today. Since 2019, Washington and Taipei have belatedly initiated measures that will help make up lost ground. The United States is assisting Taiwan in the acquisition and fielding of combat-credible capabilities to counter a PLA assault, including large numbers of road-mobile anti-ship and shoulder-fired anti-air and anti-tank missiles. To be successful, Taiwan's military leadership needs to commit to a realistic defense plan with sufficient survivable capabilities focused on denying, or at least delaying, a PLA lodgment, i.e., control of an air or seaport enabling follow-on troops to flow into Taiwan. Perversely, avoiding provocation in past years has dramatically increased the likelihood and danger of major conflict today. In addition to rectifying operational deficiencies, Washington has openly crossed some of Beijing's long-perceived security-related red lines, with no direct consequences, including the permanent deployment of U.S. Marine security guards in Taipei, the export of advanced fighter jets and offensive weapons, and the revelation of U.S. Special Operations training counterparts in Taiwan. During the Trump administration, the vice president and cabinet secretaries routinely and openly voiced support for Taiwan and condemned China's aggression, a practice that the Biden administration has sustained. In 2020, U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien declassified and released President Reagan's 1982 Six Assurances to Taipei, effectively invalidating President Clinton's 1998 Three No's statement in Shanghai, an unreciprocated concession of the U.S.-China constructive engagement period. While Kissinger had discussed the Three No's in his first private bilateral discussions with Beijing in 1971, Clinton went further by articulating them as U.S. policy. Biden invited Taiwan's ambassador equivalent to attend his inauguration ceremony and has explicitly kept the Six Assurances as a pillar of his One China policy. Despite a long-standing policy of ambiguity regarding U.S. intervention, Biden has indicated at least 3 times that the United States is committed to militarily defending Taiwan, revealing his own instincts as commander-in-chief. In all cases, U.S. officials later clarified that these did not indicate a policy change. Shortly after assuming office, Biden opined that she doesn't have a democratic bone in his body and predicted extreme U.S.-China competition. In describing a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, Biden believes that the world is in the midst of an historic and fundamental debate about its future direction. Freedom House ranks Taiwan as Asia's second freest country and the seventh freest in the world. By inviting Taiwan to participate in his December 2021 inaugural Summit for Democracy, Biden sent a signal to China and the world: the Taiwanese people must be allowed to choose their own path. That same week, the top Indo-Pacific policy officials at the State and Defense Departments articulated the geostrategic case that Taiwan is critical to the defense of vital U.S. interests in recorded testimony to the U.S. Congress. Between the U.S. administration's rhetoric and the CCP's innate anxiety over hostile Western forces, Beijing views U.S. attempts to reassure as insincere. China's ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang, expressed this plainly, while misstating the U.S. position and other historical facts. In a May 2022 editorial published the same day, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken asserted that Beijing's words and actions are deeply destabilizing and threaten the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. The very next day, in his remarks commissioning new U.S. military officers, Biden relayed what she had said on a call: democracies cannot be sustained in the 21st century. Autocracies will run the world. Biden told the U.S. officers flatly that she was wrong and that they would be the representatives and defenders of our democracy. Comprehensive deterrence. In January 2022, Qin warned, if the Taiwanese authorities, emboldened by the United States, keep going down the road to independence, it most likely will involve China and the United States, the two big countries, in a military conflict. 2 weeks later, in its updated Indo-Pacific strategy, the White House responded by committing to ensure an environment in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully in accordance with the wishes and best interests of Taiwan's people. Barring a major policy shift in one of the three capitals, their respective policies and politics are crowding out mutually acceptable alternatives or concessions, potentially leaving open only one path to resolution for Beijing: the use of force. Washington would be wise to accept that an autocratic China is firmly committed to annexing a democratic Taiwan. The United States and its allies should shift away from a hedging strategy, which often compromises deterrence to preserve political space for a quixotic negotiated resolution. Instead, the United States should take the lead among allies in adopting a comprehensive deterrence strategy. In addition to urgently fielding relevant military capabilities to increase Beijing's perceived risk, Washington and its allies should also take steps to raise Beijing's perceived costs, expecting and accepting that such steps might engender diplomatic tantrums, saber-rattling, and other forms of retaliation and brinksmanship from Beijing. In the wake of the recent U.S. overtures related to Taiwan's security, the response among allies has been positive. In 2020, following approvals for $12 billion in U.S. arms sales to Taiwan by the Trump administration, a French firm signed a contract to upgrade Taiwan's 30-year-old Lafayette frigates, despite a 1994 Sino-French agreement that had halted French security assistance to Taiwan. In 2021 and again in 2022, U.S. leader and minister-level joint statements with Japan, Korea, and the G7 called for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, occasioning rote complaints from Beijing. Washington and its allies should also take steps to raise Beijing's perceived costs, expecting and accepting that such steps might engender diplomatic tantrums, saber-rattling, and other forms of retaliation and brinksmanship from Beijing. In July 2021, Japan's Deputy Prime Minister said the quiet part out loud, that Japan would join the United States in defending Taiwan in a contingency. And then in October, the UK Defence Minister warned China to cease its destabilizing and provocative military activities toward Taiwan. The following month, Australia's Defence Minister indicated that Canberra would also join a US-led coalition to defend Taiwan in a conflict. These allied expressions of solidarity elicited predictable rebukes from China's messaging apparatus, precisely because they enhance cross-strait deterrence by forcing Beijing to consider greater risks and costs of its potential aggression. During her January 2022 confirmation hearing, U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs Celeste Wallander told Congress that the U.S. response to Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea was too slow and too incremental. And it's confirmed by the lessons that I learned, and that I believe others in the national security community learned. The editorial board of The Washington Post put it more succinctly, saying when past U.S. policy has failed in Ukraine, it was often because, fearing to provoke Mr. Putin, it did not do enough to deter him. Stronger signals of U.S. and allied resolve earlier arguably could have prevented the initiation of the security dilemma that culminated in open warfare in Ukraine. Having underestimated the West's determination, Putin found himself having to choose between preserving either his own political legitimacy or Russia's economic well-being. He predictably chose the former. Given the stakes of a Taiwan Strait scenario, the United States and its allies need to present unambiguous deterrence signals to Xi before he sets similar irreversible wheels into motion. Recommendations. In addition to accelerating military capability enhancements in Taiwan and the region, the administration should take near-term steps to implement Biden's foreign policy doctrine in regards to the Taiwan Strait. Washington needs to demonstrate that democracies can defend themselves against a rising tide of authoritarianism. Firm U.S. leadership will encourage allies to recognize the stakes and join in deterring or responding to cross-strait aggression. Below are 4 immediate opportunities to signal resolve to Beijing, Taipei, and key allies and partners. The U.S. State Department should amend its day-to-day policy articulation to match President Biden's rhetoric and strategic guidance. During the U.S.-China engagement era, American diplomats and spokespersons were trained to diffuse Beijing's rhetorical challenges using staid non-answers. Example, we are committed to our one China policy based on. In an era of competition, the United States need not appease and should not surrender the narrative. Washington should turn the tables and actively demand that Beijing return to its fundamental policy to strive for a peaceful solution as agreed in the final U.S.-China joint communiqué in 1982. Both privately and publicly, U.S. officials should press Beijing to demonstrate sincerity by abandoning its anti-secession law and reorienting PLA missiles and other offensive forces away from Taiwan. When China fails to heed these calls, U.S. allies and partners would then absorb and possibly even amplify the message that Beijing created this powder keg, not Washington. This, in turn, would make it more difficult for Xi to justify Chinese aggression to the world. China repeats Russia's narrative that the United States caused and perpetuated the war in Ukraine by expanding NATO and arming the Nazis. Sowing seeds of justification for future aggression, Beijing explicitly connects NATO expansion to maturing U.S. partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. She parrots Putin's zero-sum concept of indivisible security to preemptively shift the blame for Beijing's own violent plans. Washington cannot afford to cede ground in the discourse power contest that will assign responsibility for conflict in the eyes of the world. just as the United States concluded that it must shape the strategic environment around Beijing rather than change China through engagement. One of China's principal goals in engaging the United States and others in high-level diplomacy is to bend regional and global narratives in its favor. The U.S. military should normalize public messaging regarding U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation, which takes place under the auspices of the non-governmental American Institute in Taiwan. Between 2018 and 2019, the Taiwanese armed forces hosted more than 250 U.S. delegations involving thousands of personnel. Beijing, with its extensive intelligence networks, is well aware of these activities, but the broader public, inside and outside of China, remains largely in the dark. This is a missed opportunity. In addition to building partner capacity, U.S. military engagement aims to deter adversaries and reassure allies. The United States actively promotes island defense training engagements with Japan and the Philippines, two of Taiwan's neighbors who have territorial disputes with China. The U.S. Defense Department publicizes its defensive cyber cooperation with partners such as Estonia and Lithuania, who, like Taiwan, face continuous state-sponsored cyber attacks from a threatening neighbor. In the case of Taiwan, however, the United States routinely bypasses such opportunities for messaging deterrence and reassurance. Pro-China media in Taiwan often accuse Washington of unloading second-rate weapons on Taiwan at inflated prices. As Beijing tells it, the United States is stirring up trouble to line its own pockets. Despite a U.S. legal obligation under the Taiwan Relations Act to provide both equipment and training, defense articles and services, proportional to the threat, the Defense Department remains hesitant to promote or even acknowledge its numerous U.S.-funded military exchanges with Taiwan. Public reporting of these activities would blunt anti-U.S. narratives in the region and raise Taiwanese confidence and will to fight. Tsai reportedly chastised Tsai for publicly confirming the presence of U.S. military trainers in Taiwan. But Tsai's honest response to a direct question may have contributed favorably to the Australian Defence Minister remarking only 2 weeks later that it would be inconceivable that we, Australia, wouldn't support the U.S. in an action to defend Taiwan. Washington's instinct to obscure security cooperation with Taiwan is a relic of a lead-from-behind hedging strategy. Washington's instinct to obscure security cooperation with Taiwan is a relic of a lead-from-behind hedging strategy. Under a competitive strategy, the United States should prioritize collective deterrence messaging above sensitivity to Beijing's narrative preferences. There should be neither shame nor fear in building Taiwan's capacity to deter or deny an attack, a mission that serves U.S. and allied vital interests. As it does with other U.S. agencies' activities, the American Institute in Taiwan should promote military-to-military interactions through statements, press conferences, websites, and social media. With more assertive U.S. leadership on security cooperation with Taiwan, close allies would also increase cooperation with them, further weighing on Beijing's calculus. Biden should explicitly grant his top aides the authority needed to sever or disrupt China's technology and energy supplies. Just as the United States maintains a honed military force to promote peace and stability, it should also sharpen its economic tools of deterrence, before the advent of hot conflict, not after, as with Ukraine. In June 2021, Biden broadened the Treasury Secretary's authority to restrict U.S. portfolio investment in China's military-industrial complex to cover surveillance technology companies contributing to human rights violations. Given the potential threat to global stability and prosperity, Biden should preemptively expand these powers to levy full blocking sanctions against people and organizations that contribute to cross-strait aggression. He should also grant his state and homeland security departments the authority to designate and block the U.S. entry of such individuals and their family members. Leading by example, the administration should encourage allies to preemptively develop the legal authority to impose similar sanctions in response to Chinese aggression. Taken together, these formalized policies would constitute appropriate and proportional responses to Beijing's anti-secession law and other forms of coercion. Biden and Congress should ensure that appropriate authorities exist to counter China across the spectrum of conflict. Under the Taiwan Relations Act, the President is obligated to consult with Congress on a response to any threat to the security or the social or economic system of Taiwan. One could argue that the threshold has already been met. Regardless of whether the act is formally invoked, the executive branch should have mechanisms in place for immediate crisis response short of armed conflict, including options for covert and clandestine operations in the space, cyber, and undersea domains. No new actions need be taken unless and until Beijing chooses to act out. But explicitly articulating and delegating these authorities now would necessarily weigh on Xi's cost-benefit analysis. Conclusion. When it was first articulated, the One China Compromise allowed Washington and Beijing to shelve the question of Taiwan's sovereignty and focus on the common threat emanating from Moscow. After 1991, this truce was extended as the United States and China found new common causes. More recently, divergent views on the benefits of globalization and goals of counterterrorism have emerged on either side of the Pacific. And global developments have exposed the impotence of U.S.-China engagement on issues ranging from health security and non-proliferation to climate change and human rights. Having witnessed the enduring trends of a growing Taiwanese democratic self-identity, a rapidly improving PLA, and a hardening of China's autocracy, Washington and the free world need to acknowledge that the status quo is unstable, if not unsustainable. Over more than 70 years, the regime in Beijing, abetted by U.S. and global passivity, has become more dogmatic about subjugating Taiwan. No amount of affirmative U.S. engagement has or will alter this catechism. As China attains the military capability to effect a forceful takeover of Taiwan, the United States should instead employ all measures to dissuade a cross-strait conflict. Arguably, U.S. hesitation to arm Ukraine and the lifting of sanctions on Nord Stream 2 sent the exact wrong signals to Putin, leading him to underestimate U.S. and allied resolve. A similar strategic miscue toward Xi could be catastrophic. In addition to mass casualties and displacements within Taiwan, a large-scale cross-strait conflict would induce a major global economic downturn and associated humanitarian crisis. In the opening of his March 2022 State of Union address, President Biden reflected, "Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos, they keep moving. And the costs, the threats to America and to the world keep rising." American diplomacy matters. American resolve matters. Speaking a week after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Biden was lamenting that the world had just relearned the lesson. Washington and its allies need to clearly demonstrate their resolve to avoid repeating the lesson yet again in the Taiwan Strait. In addition to urgently fielding effective military capabilities, the United States should strengthen and multilateralize credible strategic signals to comprehensively deter Beijing.